this is a spoiler,
You can't
you
listen to
know.
this and not have spoilers. I imagine you guys have heard me a few times if you listen to the podcast, but would you mind, and I'm happy to introduce myself more if you'd like, but would you guys mind introducing yourselves a little bit? And Nathan, you've been running this fiction group for a while, right?
Yeah, I started it off whenever it's funny. I asked before there was a not school. I messaged Mark and asked him, guys, please, can anybody read Blood Meridian? It's been on my mind, and I kind of need to get it out of me. And that was whenever No Country for Old Men. You guys did that reading, and it was wonderful. But I have a background in literature. I studied literature in university. I've been reading and trying to get groups of readers together for a while. Yeah, I'm an artist and performer living in Chicago. I
Oh,
write
just
sketches.
down the street.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, I'm up in Madison.
Okay, all right. Well, yeah, that's
Cool.
All right. I'm Jordan. I'm 25. I live in Las Vegas, and I studied art at university, and I continue to do that. And I also run a short story club it meets more regularly, and the reading isn't. I guess it's a different approach to sort of. We don't really talk a lot about philosophy, I guess, in it, but I have a large interest in literature and sort of that, along with doing art, photography, that sort of thing.
Very cool.
yeah. We've had a few discussions, and we have seemed to center around that. There's something to be gotten out of reading literature, but approaching fiction and describing it is pretty difficult. There's not things are strung out through the story and threads that might not be simply stated in a chapter like reading philosophy. So as we've come to have these conversations, we've read passages that we've thought have been important or looked at words that have come up often and again, and then also tried to take angles of all the characters. So instead of looking at what one person says and taking that as the truth of the book, we've tried looking at what the response is internally within the novel. Yeah, we've read Don DeLillo's The Body Artist and Cosmicomics by Italo Calvino and Thomas Pynchon's Crying of Lot 49. I'm trying to think of, I feel like there's another one out there I'm forgetting, but
Yeah, I think that's everything actually.
so I mean, I guess I would suppose maybe we could help guide ourselves with a short look over what the book is, just for people who might not read the book. That's kind of how I imagine this is being read. Maybe people who've read it or won't read it, but want to understand what the novel's dealing with.
Sure, and I wanted to chime in that I think that your approach about it is great, and that I know that on PEL we have decidedly focused on philosophy, even if we've done Candide and No Country for Old Men and stuff like that. But I personally like the idea very much of understanding, examining and the examined life is pretty broadly and fitting in very well with taking literature pretty seriously. Um, maybe it's right to not take it as analytical philosophy. I don't see a real big problem with that.
Yeah.
But taking it and having it be worthwhile to spend time with the text and look at its different facets in, as you mentioned, Nathan, that you end up having other angles into it. And the closest I've seen with doing that is when you read Plato and you want to think, besides about thinking about, the allegory of the cave or whatever, you might also think about, what the character of Glaucon or Thrasymachus is like. Because, after all, they are speaking to one another, and, it might not be a play exactly, but there's interactions between the characters that have things to say about what's going on in what Plato's doing in addition. So I don't mean to, say that that's the way all fiction works. But I think that that's an example of philosophy, of where paying attention to the way it's put together and the way the work evolves is very, very fruitful. And I think it gets embodied in looking at something in literature. So I think it's great. I think that it'd be nice for us to, on PEL, to be able to do more literature. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think about the kind of unfolding really applies in the novel with the kid's character. I feel like I want to get ahead of myself, but I think that.
Well, why don't you give the summary that you were talking about, sort of the basic stuff about it? I think that's a good place, and then launch into the stuff about the kid.
Yeah, sure. The novel begins in 1833. There's a child whose mother dies, and he runs away. And when he runs away, he works for money. He gets into fights. He encounters a lot of different kinds of men, violent men, hermits, religious figures like a priest and a Mennonite. And he eventually comes to ride with the gang of scalp hunters at the age of 16. And we follow him through the Mexican desert as he rides with these men that go through cities and collect rewards and maraud. And at the end of the novel, as it closes, you get the sense that he's lived this mighty, violent life, more violent than you would expect of someone, and he's given it up. And he struggles with how to live outside of that. What kind of moral ground is there to stand on, and those things, even though he participates in the violence. And I guess that's like spoiler free and brief, but yeah.
Yeah, and I guess we'll hopefully come back to this particular point, but it does point out a certain plotlessness about the book. Not that there isn't some plot, but it's not exactly a plot-driven book. It's more like there is a book that's sort of draped over a plot of sorts. So we can talk about that as things goes along. But
yeah, I remember the first time I read this back in university, and I didn't know what I was. I didn't know. I didn't feel like I was moving forward in time. Sometimes I didn't know where I was, or who I was with anymore, or who was speaking. And there is a sense, because of the novel's language. And I mean, it'll just make a statement in the middle of some descriptor, and you don't know whose perspective it is. There's not punctuation. The gang often moves through, people disappear, and they'll come back, in some kind of a scene where maybe they've been murdered. And if you haven't been paying attention, you might not realize what's happened to other people, even though they've seemingly disappeared from the novel. Though there often is explanations kind of stuck in of the gang of followers, and when they lose people, if you look in later on, they come back in an interesting way, or what happens to them in conversation, how people say what happened is very different than what actually did, but it's not always very clear.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the structure of the novel and its sort of plotlessness, and you brought up the fact that he doesn't use quotation marks, and he rarely uses commas. That sort of aligns with sort of the landscape of where it takes place, and the sort of it has a lot to do with the morality and whatnot. But it just, to me, the structure and the way he writes seems sort of you can't separate those two things from, I think, what he's interested in, what he's trying to explore. But I definitely did feel that sort of I wasn't moving anywhere. It was like I had to start and stop a couple times because this was the first time I had read it. And, yeah.
I confess it was the first time I made it all the way through.
Yeah.
I had started it 2 or 3 times. And I've read several of his other books, and I don't want to compare them right yet. But it's the kind of book that you have to, the way it is written, I think you're right, Jordan, matters a lot to the subject matter and the content of the book. And I think you're right that, like, one of the reasons why, even if you didn't like it, that you would put it in a category of great literature is the way in which the landscape is effectively recapitulated in the way the book is written, the language and the structure of the punctuation, even, as you pointed out. I think that's right.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I think about this landscape, I think about how things come to appear and disappear very easily. There's things that are stated as a matter of fact, and I think that they're stated phenomenally. Like when the kid and Spruly are in the mountains and they think they see a city on a lake shore, and they're overwhelmed, with happiness, and then they wake up and they find that it's disappeared completely. And things have a way of coming in and out of existence. It's like as they follow along. I don't know if you guys play those video games where there's a fog of war over the world, and as you move through it, things clear up and you can kind of see where you've gone. Like you increase the known world and take away the unknown. Uh-huh. And I see that gang kind of doing that as they explore, and things that they encounter and wipe away are only carried in their memory of it. And there's a mule that disappears one time, and I think the quote is, "It disappeared from the mind of any living thing that was." And there's constantly just this pulling out of, I guess it's a phenomenal existence, or maybe that's what the judge argues is like the only existence.
Yeah, at the end, this question of memory looms large in the last chapter. And if there's anything that seems like plot, is there's a handful of scenes that are very, very event-driven, and that are genuinely scenes rather than something like ambiance isn't quite the right word, but
kind of like a movement, right?
Yeah. So at the end, when the judge he basically sort of lays it out for the man at the end about the nature of memory and the nature of our existence and the distinction between what we remember and the truth of that versus the truth of what anybody else had said, and whether there is fact in history or not, which he seems to just deny that those distinctions are there.
Yeah, he says that men's memories are uncertain, in the past that was differs little from the past that was not.
Yep.
I've thought about that phrase a lot. Have anybody, I mean, do either of you have more of a sense of that? I think I take it to understand that if you misremember something, but that's the only memory, then that is all that counts in history, and that's equally valid as what didn't, because no one could say that it did not.
I think it's even stronger than that. I think that it's in that it's not just a question of whether the thought has disappeared in the sands of time. It's that your memory versus my memory, or your account versus anybody else's account, the fact of the matter isn't the judge of it. That he's denying that there is a kind of fact of the matter. In that way, seems to me a very, he's a robustly nihilistic character in living in a kind of utterly present way.
It's interesting that, I mean, because the kind of going back to the structure is that you have, the judge essentially, the moment when something is sort of plot or event driven, it's the judge, and the judge is the speaking, but the book is loosely based on characters who actually exist, and I don't know, to me, I couldn't help but think about McCarthy using that as a device to talk about those kinds of things too. Not that he's necessarily interested in that history, but that by not entirely creating up, he sort of lets you sort of think about those things.
Did either of you probably did, Nathan, because you referred us to it, listen to those lectures by that literature professor, Amy
Hungerford? Yeah.
Hungerford. So she has a whole interpretation on this that that McCarthy has said before that, it's a sad fact that all books are made of other books. And she kind of runs with that idea, or takes that as a thematizing idea to understand, look for the various reflections of other artwork, other literature in his book, and then think about the ways in which he's changed them. So she actually has a sort of, she says, a stack of books that she would lie alongside Blood Meridian, that she argues he clearly pulls from Moby Dick, Paradise Lost. There's a poem by Wordsworth that she mentions, and I think she's pretty persuasive that at the very least those allusions are in there. And the other one is the commentary about the Dalton gang by this guy Chamberlain, who tells that story, and he apparently McCarthy apparently read pretty carefully, so that all those things are sort of put together, and there's a kind of flattening between sources of truth for the book, and as she would argue, that he's raising the literature up to accounting for truth about the world that is on par with any sort of historical fact that you would talk about.
I think he, like, the way his language is, like, in its sort of, like, biblical aura or something.
Yeah.
I think that it flattens things more because it has a certainty about it, to where, like, postmodern literature would let you know that it's doing it, and he does, but he has a much more, I don't know, it makes it much more flatter in his, I don't know if certainty is the right word, but.
Do you think part of that is also sort of the utter lack of an interiority to the characters?
Yeah. There's no, like, self-conscious, like, where those other things might be doing it with some sort of self-consciousness that doesn't really exist in this.
Yeah, it's all action. We talked about this in No Country for Old Men, in that podcast, that it's just sort of one action after another, that it's not clear that they speak for themselves, but that's, all of these bandits and cowboys and stuff like that, they just do things. And the closest you get to any kind of reflection are sort of the monologues by the judge and some of the speeches that people make. But it's not exactly reflection. It's not interiority of them. It's sort of pure exteriority. They're sort of, the judge is putting words to the way that he is. So.
And just sometimes the way that when people think he gives these speeches that seem sort of like pure, like, he'd just be projecting these things onto these people. But he always seems to, like, smile when people, like, draw into question, like, his sanity, or do you really believe these things? And I don't know, like, the smile for me was, like, the only thing that I ever felt like had any time where something could be sort of drawn into question, or any level of interiority, because it was, like, maybe unclear what the smile, like what you're doing when you smile. I don't know, that just kept, like, he would always smile after things, and
I looked that up. I went back and searched it, and all the smile scenes are really interesting. It's mostly whenever there's this one scene where there's a magic trick being done with a juggler, and then Black Jackson is looking around, and he's like, "What's she saying? What's she saying? What's she saying?" And she asks a few people, like Brown and Glanton and the kid or something, and then he finally asks the judge. And the judge is just, like, happy to give his opinion of it, and he smiles, and, like, he's been being consulted, he's being conferred with for his judgment on things, and it's really interesting because there was another scene where he's pulling out. They've given marked arrows to draw lots to kill some of their members who are wounded and can't continue anymore, and the kid goes to draw one, and the judge is watching him, and the kid changes which arrow he was going for, thinking that maybe the judge was tricking him, and he picks one, and it happens to be a bad arrow that he has to stay and kill somebody. And the judge isn't looking when the kid turns to look back. It's almost as if he's disappointed that the kid was that superstitious. Or, yeah, there's just a couple of interesting things like that where you can just tell by the smile or the glances back and forth between the men, something more internal. Because I think that Blood Meridian gets a rap for being exterior, though there are a few times, like Amy Hungerford, the professor we were talking about, seems to lay out this case where, the kid helps people, but is he really, benevolent, or what does he think? And I think there's a really strong sense that he's a moral person, even if he does get involved the way that he does with this gang. I mean, he tries to like save an old woman at the end, and he only joins the gang whenever he's in jail, or he gets enlisted in the army when he's living in the woods. He runs away from home because his mother dies. It's not like he's choosing to be like a bad guy.
Well, so this is an interesting thing to talk about, in particular, what the moral status of the kid is, and these scenes where there are glimmers of something like conventional morality for a number of the characters that then are almost uniformly left unacted upon. Or if they are, we can talk about that. But the kid starts out, his mother dies, and then that third paragraph, the mother dead these 14 years did incubate in her own bosom the creature who would carry her off. The father never speaks her name, the child does not know it. He has a sister in this world, and he will not see again. He watches pale and unwashed. He can neither read nor write, and in him broods already a taste for mindless violence. All history present in that visage, the child, the father of the man. So, right from the beginning, as a young child, he has this taste for mindless violence, and you have him, freak out in this bar because he wants to, sweep the floor for a drink. And in fact, he goes and sweeps the floor, and the bartender still won't give him a drink, and he kills the bartender with a broken bottle in the eye. And then that scene is the very, very beginning, and it bookmarks with at the very end of the book, where the man shoots that boy who's come back to his camp, who he told the boy's compatriots, don't have him show up because I'm going to kill him. And so I wonder about that. If it is the case that the kid has some kind of internal morality as distinct from, say, the judge, is it that he's just incontinent with respect to that he's so that he's violent in the way he is, or his mindless violence, or is it that he isn't moral and doesn't really understand himself very well, and doesn't live the full life that he ought to from the judge's perspective, that he kind of is weak, those glimmers of morality are essentially his weakness, as it would be from the judge's perspective.
Yeah, a flaw in the fabric of his heart.
Yes.
Well, just to stay with the kid and his actions, he is a fighter, and he is violent, but the fact that he that he offers to pay, that's some kind of contract, and he goes to get a drink behind the bar in that scene, and the bartender comes out to meet him.
Yeah.
And there's another scene later where he meets Toadvine, and he's coming out of an outhouse, and Toadvine's coming down, and it's muddy, and the guy says, get out of my way. And the kid refuses to do that, or to step off for this guy. And then that encounters a fight. So it's almost as if the way he's living is got some kind of a certainty to it, and that causes conflict. Because there's one time you get what he's feeling is on that 4th page whenever he's in New Orleans and fighting in a bar.
Yep.
And he's just beat a sailor up, and they fight with fists, with feet, with bottles or knives, all races, all breeds, men whose speech sounds like the grunting of apes, men from lands so far and queer, that standing over them where they lie bleeding in the mud, he feels mankind itself vindicated. And now that's interesting that he has that kind of a formed thought about it. That seems more like something that the judge would say about conquering in a fight. So that there's some kind of universal vindication of that.
Yeah, so the idea there, just to recapitulate it, is that in that violence, the kid feels the greatness of man.
Mm. Yeah.
Which you're right. That's like, word for word, life is war, from the judge. So it makes you feel like at this point the kid is a child judge.
Yes. And I'm not so sure. I mean, I feel like this is getting ahead of it, but there's such a blend in the narrative and the judge's perspective that I wonder how much is something in both of them going on through the whole book, or the judge is narrating somehow, or there's some kind of version of the story. I mean, it starts with see the child, and it's really interesting that the judge is so taken with the kid. I mean, we know that the judge is a pedophile, or that he's at least interested in innocence in some way. I mean, he does sleep with children, he does kill children, and he's fascinated with the kid. I mean, he goes to meet him in jail and tries at this last moment to bring the kid back into him again, or to have him understand a betrayal that he felt. And, he's standing there with the kid in the jail at the end of all their journeys, and the judge is reaching through the bars, and he's just like, let me touch you. That's really important to him, like to be able to bring him in. And, and at the end of the novel, I mean, this is a spoiler full thing.
Oh, yeah. You can't listen to this and not have spoilers.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a sense that like and then he brings the man that used to be a kid into him at the end in this like giant bear consumptive hug thing. There's just something interesting going on with what he sees, why the judge needs the witness of the kid the way that he does, why he needs that version of something going on in his mind to be changed so that he feels good. I don't know.
Well, I have to say that by the end with the judge, I wondered, he's certainly portrayed as a supernatural figure. At the very last paragraph of the book, the tense of the book changes. It becomes in the present tense. And it becomes lyrical in a way. And the image of the judge, it seems to fully capitulate the notion that the judge is sort of the devil, or is immortal in that way, is a character of nature, not a human being, and that's the judge's own notion. And it made me wonder throughout it, especially when I got there, what the judge really was throughout the book.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't until the end I felt like the judge had this kind of shadow in the book, but Clanton was really the evil guy. The judge is also evil, but in a strangely different way. Throughout, I mean, the judge is walking in out of the desert completely naked, and under hardship in certain ways, but it's not even clear that he's a man.
It's not clear he ages, right?
Yes,
and
yes.
There's a lot of passages where he steps across a fire, and it says maybe he was somehow native to the element of fire. Somehow his being is tied up with that natural thing that you mentioned. And then the first time you see him, the Reverend Green, he says, "This is the devil. This is him. Here he is in the flesh." And so from the beginning, you do get this sense that the judge has been seen everywhere at some point in time.
Yes.
By every person.
Yes.
He's, masterful in all regards and doesn't seem to be ever in worry. Even when he's being pursued without arms, he's smiling and serene, and, the shambling mutant going from group to group, and just he is effortless in his abilities.
And that's where I think that I forgot her name again. It's Amy Hungerford. I think she's absolutely right, and I was thinking this when I was reading it, that you have to, if you've ever read it, you have to think of Paradise Lost when you're reading this book. When you see the judge and think of him as like the character of the devil in Paradise Lost, of this incredibly attractive, persuasive figure, who you end up having certain kinds of sympathies with that you don't really want to have sympathies with, and I ended up. I guess I still don't know. I still don't know if I shouldn't somehow read it almost like a magical realism that the judge really isn't a man. He's like a character that people encounter, and he sort of lays in flesh between them, but he somehow isn't actually a man, or not. Maybe it doesn't really matter.
Well, there's a. I'm sorry, Jordan. Were you getting ready to say something?
I just think that like that in between spot is what makes him so interesting. Is he gets to embody us, so you do the sort of thing where you can sort of project yourself into him or see parts of yourself, but then he is always just you're always reminded that he's sort of just outside or above you. And I don't know, for me, it makes him, or some of the things that he says or does, or the way he is, like almost more, like that's what makes him more desirable to want to listen, is because in a way, even though he is like a giant bald man, like that you could somehow become this, or I don't know, yeah. I just think that the in-between sort of mythic and human, makes him a really rich idea.
It's worth pointing out that he's more than just bald, right? He's completely hairless.
Yeah, he's even described as a giant infant.
Yes.
At the end of the book.
Yeah.
There's a. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that very idea that you mentioned of Dylan about him maybe being more than is touched on in the book. There's on 297 they're running the ex-priest and the kid through the desert away from the judge, and the ex-priest wants him to stand the judge down, and or he's wounded and they're trying to get on, and the kid is thinking about staying and fighting, and the priest is shaking his hand saying, go on. He waved his hand, and the kid spoke to him, and he says, he ain't nothing. You told me so yourself. Men are made of the dust of the earth. You said it was no pair, and the priest answers, parable. No parable, that it was a naked fact and the judge was a man like all men. And he doesn't face him down because he says that he's unarmed, now that he's mismatched with him. So you don't really get to try this out. But the kid, a moment before this, was standing over the judge naked in this watering hole. He had guns and he didn't pull one out and shoot him. I mean, that decision right there is interesting on the kid's part. If he really thinks this man is so terrible to live and make a claim on the world, then shouldn't he remove him from it? But he doesn't think so. Yeah, or he doesn't do it.
Yeah, and he's not the first one. But can you actually clear something up for me? Mm-hmm. It was confusing to me at this point why it turned so that the judge was pursuing them. Is it as simple as he thinks that the priest and the kid betrayed them to the Yumas?
No, that's what he says. So that's what the judge says whenever the priest and the kid. So whenever they have that encampment at the fort, they are just making a mess of things, right? And they are charging too much for the ferry and killing people and sending bodies downriver. And eventually, a band of Yumas attack them and eliminate them.
Yeah, after they had betrayed the Yumas, right? They had conspired with the Yumas to take over the ferry, and instead of convinced them to do that, and what it ended up being was a ruse, so that they could take over the ferry from the ferrymaster, and they did that by turning the cannon on the Yumas while they were attacking the villagers. And then, or the people on the travelers,
yeah.
And then, as you said, they proceeded to charge too much, and then eventually they were just outright robbing and raping and killing everybody that came by.
Yeah, there was a little girl tied, bound with a rope to her neck,
Yeah.
just in the yard. I mean, it gets awfully degenerate at that point,
Yeah.
before the Yuma's attack.
Yeah, and so the idea, and it's like over a couple of months, in fact, and there's I interpreted it as the Yumas, sort of regrouped and got together other portions of the tribe to go then and attack.
Yeah, there's an
avenge.
assassination party. I mean, it's the special group that moves in by night with black face paint and red streaks, and they're explicitly going in to take out the Glanton gang.
Yeah.
And
out of revenge. So
yes, and they all get thrown out into the wilderness, and the kid, the priest, Toadvine, and the judge all come on each other. And the judge doesn't have anything. He has meat strapped to him that he somehow got. He has gold in a sack, but he doesn't have any weapons, and he doesn't have a hat. He has the idiot on a leash, and the kid and the priest refuse him. They don't want to ride with him anymore. And Toadvine stays with the judge. And anyway, so the priest and the kid take off. They've abandoned and betrayed the judge. They've left him unarmed. They won't help him or share with his meat. And they run into Davy Brown coming back from San Francisco. Davy Brown wonders what's behind them, what happened. The whole Glanton gang's gone under, and he goes to meet the judge. The kid and the priest continue. What must have happened was the judge traded money for Davy Brown's guns like he traded Toadvine for his hat. And then now the judge is armed again, and he's going in the same direction as the kid and the priest, so that they only have the opportunity to hide from him once, and then that's whenever he passes, comes back after realizing he's been hid from, and then continues back on. So he passes 3 times. And then interchange.
So the idea is there that at the very least, the offense is that he abandons or refuses to join with him or stay with him.
And the priest wants the kid to shoot the judge. In front of the judge, he says that. He says, he gets so scared that he even says it out loud, is what the book says. And he says, for the love of God, do it, man, kill him. You won't get another chance. Do it. If your life is forfeit if you don't.
And what's your understanding of why I guess sort of thinking about what does it mean to say that they didn't want to participate anymore after the attack of the Yumas? They don't want to be around the judge because they've decided now is just the time to cut loose, that this is just, it already been more than we wanted to deal with, kind of thing?
Yeah, well, there's there's one attack before they control the ferry, and it's a peaceful village that they attack, and they say so. It says they were peaceful, they were just slaughtered, and no one stood them any defense. And then after they're riding out, I think it's Toadvine, the kid, and one other person, and Toadvine says, them sons of bitches weren't bothering nobody, and he's worried about it. He doesn't feel right about what they just did. And then the other guy looks at Toadvine and he sees the branding, the criminal brands on his face, and they all ride on like, well, he's done this before. What's so bad about this? But you do get the sense that they are hitting this kind of moral limit to what they can do. And the kid, again, didn't even want to be with scalp hunters. I mean, he was in jail in Chihuahua City. And whenever Glenn's gang came through, he enlisted to get out of jail in a foreign country. I mean, so it's not as if like he's somehow changed his mind about the goodness of these guys. And you can't run away. I mean, people do run away from the gang and they get killed, or it's deserting and then you get killed by the gang. So, I mean, I think there's a lot in that decision.
Yeah, and in fact, Toadvine is the one who gets the kid as a member of the gang.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Toadvine is the other character who has a gun to Holden's head.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned this earlier. And he refuses. He doesn't pull the trigger either. Even when being told by the judge, either pull the trigger or pull it away. And though the judge doesn't kill him.
Well, he wins right there. It's what the
judge
that's
true.
He's
won. You're right.
He's talking to the priest, and the priest says, don't. War is God, whatever, Holden, you're crazy. I'm not going to second say you and your notions. And then the judge says, you don't have to second say me. What can you give me that I haven't already gotten from you? You know, he's riding with the gang. And so, and even whenever Toadvine pulls the gun out, and remember, he pulls it out because they find this Indian boy, and then Judge is playing with it, and they're getting ready to mount up and ride to town and change in scalps. So he breaks this kid's neck and scalps him, and then throws it in with a lot of other, you know, money scalps. Yep. And then Toadvine pulls the gun on him. And then whenever he pulls it away, the judge smiles. Like he won right there. It's,
Gee, why do you think that they don't, like, no one kills him or chooses, or?
I think maybe you would have to judge. If you did that, then you would become what the judge is. Like you would be you'd be like the baddest man now. I mean, I don't know if that's too simple to put it, but you would then be the king of the hill, and you wouldn't have anyone else to say is worse than you. And all the things that you've participated in would just be, I don't know. I mean, because the only thing for the judge is to kill him. I mean, if you listen to him, you offer yourself under his control because he's going to be able to persuade you. But even whenever you know that he's lying to your face, and, you know, people get scared listening to him, like the veins throb in their heads, and people say, like, stop your ears, don't listen, like it's too much. And people shy away whenever he's trying to give out candy. They know he's a predator, but you can't stop him outside of killing him. And I don't know why the kid won't pull out a gun and shoot him in the head whenever he's got him dead to rights in the desert, you know, except for maybe he's trying to prove that you can have this other way, and he wants to prove that to the judge. I don't know. It's like the Batman and Joker.
Yeah, no, but let's contrast that with the last chapter or two of the book. The grown kid is been out traveling this life. We don't know much about what's happened then, but I think you're right, Nathan, sort of summarizing it as he maybe has not led quite as violent a life as he did in his first, you know, sort of 20 years. But he's inherently still kind of a violent man. And he's out in the wilderness, and he comes across this, you know, group of young people, and there's someone sort of remarkably like him as a child. Quick finger, easy to get irritated, and that kid comes back after having been threatened, and you don't know what he's going to do, and the man just kills him, and then lets his brother come back, and his younger brother, and those boys come back and get the body and go away. And then you follow that up with him going down to, you know, sort of the worst hellhole in the West, just full of debauchery. And he gets to the bar, and there's the judge. And when the judge explains that, well, he's come there because he was drawn to, and he was in fact looking for him, you feel like the judge is absolutely right about that, despite the man's protestations, that somehow he's followed the path to get back to him. But he doesn't kill him.
Yeah, there's that moment with the boy that he finds, Elrod. Amy Hungerford mentioned something interesting, that when the judge tells that story early on about the harness maker who kills, that boy that the kid kills is that man's son.
Yes.
And I thought that was really a good reading right there.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right about, he does meet him again in the bar, and the kid sees the judge, and he turns away, and he grabs his hat like he's going to go, but he doesn't move. You know, it's like, where else is he going to go? And he asks him, what reason? I'm here the same reason as any man. And the judge says, what reason is that? If you don't have a reason, then doesn't that mean you're being maneuvered here by the actions of something else, another agency? And then what is that agency is the question he asks him. Yeah. And I think it might be man. Like, mankind itself has this generative thing that it does to people if you take up arms and do it too. I don't know if that's...
Well, the judge has a kind of fatalism about it, but about life, that it happens, and so in some ways, being a happening is the greatest thing that you can be. that is something that's utterly present and in that moment utterly reflecting, having the world sort of pass through you. But Jordan, did you have a thought about why people fail to kill the judge?
I don't know. I guess for me it seemed to be maybe like you said, Nathan, about if you do it, somehow like killing like the sort of incarnation of nihilism and evil puts you in that sort of that realm, and then that they don't want to do that. But the sort of paradox is that you can't, if you what you would have to do would sort of uptake what they're doing, but you don't want to, so he has to stay around. Or even if you do kill it, like it'll always be there. Like it's almost doesn't, I guess it doesn't matter or something. Like, yeah, I don't know.
It's such a weird thing though for people who are so violent to refuse to kill. I mean, I guess I have to think about it more.
Like, where's the limit? Like, if they're so violent, then why stop now?
I mean, it's not like they don't kill people. It's not like they don't commit horrible acts willingly, right? I mean, you have to. I mean, McCarthy doesn't, I don't think, portray it for the kid in this detail, but he's fully part of this. These gangs that go on these scalp hunting missions and go through. Just like Toadvine is, even though Toadvine thinks they didn't do nothing, right? They're in there, not standing on the sidelines. They're knifing down men, women, and children, and scalping people while they're still alive. And, all of that grimness is fully participated in by them.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely it. I mean, but the kids saw whenever he goes, the first big slaughter he sees is by the hands of Indians. Whenever he gets in that bar fight and somehow word gets around that there's a fighter in town and he gets enlisted in the military, they cross over into Mexico, and then they're overrun by the Legion of Horribles, that big, long passage where you've just got this horde riding him down. And he slaughters everybody, and he only gets overlooked because he's just like in the blood so much. He's just like in the gore that they don't notice him. I mean, so I think that kind of justifies him towards a certain level of violence. He doesn't mind shooting a savage Indian.
Or shooting anybody.
The kid specifically goes to, like help wounded people, like in the platoon at the first, and then whenever that guy gets the lance at that big slaughter and they're killing everybody, he's off in the water trying to pull up, people that have been wounded. Like, he's in it, but he's like trying to stay alive on the margins of it, I think.
Yeah, that might be true. And I guess there's the question of what it means to participate in violent acts unwillingly, because I think that there's some aspect of that going. I mean, Toadvine, for instance, as clearly violent a human being as he is,
he's been marked as a violent man. Yeah,
but there's a sense that he's participating in something he doesn't really want to do. So he's doing things that he doesn't want to do. So you have to admit that into the universe here, that people do things that they don't really want to do. And
there's what Toadvine says. He's like, we're getting out of here, fellas, so don't let on like you're not a seasoned Indian killer. Like, we've never done this before, but this is our way of getting out, so say that you can kill. Yep.
You were going to say something, Jordan?
Oh, I was just saying that it's almost, the world is painted, or like the universe that is created is so violent that it's almost like any action they take seems to surmount to some sort of violent act, as if the actions just sort of are that in this universe, like, and even beyond, and that they've been placed there. Like, the kid just sort of ends up right with the Glanton gang because that's just where he ends. That's where it took him. I don't know, and the lack of interiority sort of it makes it difficult to know like what someone's actions mean, or if it is just the action that matters.
Yeah, the innocence in the people who are innocent in some way in the book are utterly window dressing.
Mm-hmm.
They commit no actions. They just happen to be there. And the Indians and the Mexicans, all of them, everybody is very, very violent, and it's sort of just a question of who ends up walking away.
Mm-hmm.
The Indians are hanging up people by their Achilles tendons and skinning them alive, and the Mexicans are, killing whoever happens to be there and raping people whenever they get a chance. It's just, everybody is. It's just hell on earth.
Well, there's an interesting justice that the book does to. I mean, I'm thinking. So one of the most horrific passages I think was just the detail of the bush or the tree that was hung with 8 children, babies, and you get a little bit later that there are these 8 men that kind of come up through the mountain and pass by the kid, and the way that it counts the babies. It says 7 of them, and then it corrects itself in the narrative. It says 8 of them. And then a little later on, it does the same miscount with the men and says there's 7 of them, 8 of them coming up. And so I get the feeling that they are the ones that did it. I don't know. But almost at the very end of the novel, the Glanton gang is moving through the woods, and they come on 8 heads arranged in a row. And it's almost as if the Indians finally caught up with these Mexicans that were terrorizing them and slaughtered them. And then there was a justice kind of built into it. So something that was seemingly just horrific at the beginning actually completes itself or has a die by the sword thing at the end for it. And there's that all through the novel with the kid. I mean, every kindness that he tries to make is thwarted. I mean, it's the old woman that he finds in the cave and he wants to take away and save is already dead. He tries to save people and they end up dying, and I don't know. So there's this, not only the actions of the men, but how it plays out in the world. And the world has got chance in it and disappointment. And I don't know. I think that's interesting also.
But the way you're talking about it makes it sound like the violence of the kid is a kind of affliction that he has, that the taste that he has for mindless violence is at the beginning is a condition of him, whereas for someone like Glanton and certainly someone like the judge, that it's a feature, not an affliction. It is in their bones and in their being, and not something that they carry with them.
I wonder just about how maybe someone like the judge would see or not see those as a distinction, where maybe the judge is a character who it's sort of when we talked about the weakness of the kid is that he sort of hasn't he can't completely live in the moment. Maybe he's thinking about things too much or something, that the fact that it was an affliction is only sort of a thought that if you sort of subsume it into yourself, that you can be something more or something like that.
I mean, I like, Jordan, you made the point earlier that it's almost as if you could do what the judge does, or if you could just bring yourself to be as large-hearted as he claims himself to be and do these terrible things, then you could also live forever, because you would have a diet that didn't care about vegetarianism, and you wouldn't have any anxiety because you wouldn't worry about what other people care about or what they want, and you would just do things as it came to you naturally, and you could somehow live a judgy life. I don't know. And I just think that that's really an interesting point, because he does seem to get his due. Like, he's dancing alive and happy at the end, It's
sort of terrifying, to me, just the dancing, I don't know, and the repeating of words, and the fact that it changes tense there, at the end when he's dancing.
Could one of you read that last passage? I just think it's so,
Sure.
I think it's so important for the novel.
Sure. Let me get it right here. Just the last paragraph?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
where you see that tense change and everything pick up.
Well, why don't I read the last two paragraphs?
Sure, sure.
Because that way you would get the sense of the tense change a little bit. So just before this, so there was a lull in the dancing, and a second fiddler took the stage, and the two plucked their strings and turned the little hardwood pegs until they were satisfied. Many among the dancers were staggering drunk through the room, and some had rid themselves of shirts and jackets, and stood bare-chested and sweating, even though the room was cold enough to cloud their breath. An enormous whore stood clapping her hands at the bandstand and calling drunkenly for the music. She wore nothing but a pair of men's drawers, and some of her sisters were likewise clad in what appeared to be trophies, hats or pantaloons or blue twill cavalry jackets. As the music sawed up, there was a lively cry from all, and a caller stood to the front and called out the dance, and the dancers stomped and hooted and lurched against one another. And they are dancing, the board floor slamming under the jackboots, and the fiddlers grinning hideously over their canted pieces. Towering over them all is the judge, and he is naked, dancing, his small feet lively and quick, and now in double time, and bowing to the ladies, huge and pale and hairless, like an enormous infant. He never sleeps, he says. He says he'll never die. He bows to the fiddlers and sashays backwards and throws back his head and laughs deep in his throat, and he is a great favorite, the judge. He wafts his hat, and the lunar dome of his skull passes palely under the lamps, and he swings about and takes possession of one of the fiddles, and he pirouettes and makes a pass, 2 passes, dancing and fiddling at once. His feet are light and nimble. He never sleeps. He says he will never die. He dances in light and in shadow, and he is a great favorite. He never sleeps, the judge. He is dancing, dancing. He says that he will never die. The end.
Oh, gosh, that's terrifying, isn't it?
It is very terrifying, actually.
I mean, a good reading. But yeah, yeah. I mean, he's just the tour de force of the book, and at this point, there's no other person for you to see things through. I mean, we don't know it, but we have a sense the kid's done. You know, he's gone. At least if he's not dead, then he doesn't have anything else to stand for anymore. At least he could have said, "I won't kill a kid," and he did that. You know, he's already past his peak meridian. You know, and he's on the downside, and yeah.
And you read the whole book. You know, and the book is set in the distant past, and you know it has this framework of being history, but there's something implicating. I don't know. For me, maybe that's just how I read things, but that when it puts you in the present, that it almost, you know, and it's the dancing sort of like it's almost as if he's looming over you as you're reading it, and for all the things that have happened, this is all that's, you know, still here. Because he seems to think, right, that history just sort of happens to people, but he's the only one that gets, you know, left standing. I don't know.
Well, and I don't think the judge would deny that history is happening for him, to him, or whatever. That's what I imagine him embodying a very radical point of view of there being really no future and no past exactly. There being a kind of utter present. I don't get the impression that he actually plans for much, or to the extent that he does, they are plans that are utterly without
design.
Yeah, well, they are plans that are utterly without force upon him. So it's not as if that planning involves deep desire for him. He would change utterly in a moment to go to do something else. So he has a motion and a direction. But it's not as if that motion and direction is toward something. It's towards something that he has to have. It's not that the direction he's moving is not a telos for him. It's not. He doesn't have a goal for himself, if that makes any sense. He's just has a way of embodying where he's at.
Yeah, I think that comes across whenever Tobin, the ex-priest, he's telling the kid about where he first saw the judge, and you see the judge sitting in the middle of the desert, just waiting. with guns and gold for somebody to come along and kind of like activate him,
Yeah.
because without other wills to, make it manifest, there's not really a judge. It's kind of like he's the avatar for what goes on between men.
Yeah, which makes sense why in the middle of the book, the relationship that he has with Glanton, he's like the riding along with Glanton. He's not the head of the gang. The judge is not the head of the gang.
No.
So
I like what you said, Nathan, about him sort of binding men together, and it's interesting to think that was it the Harold Bloom piece that he said that the judge is violence, and that they all have stories of these things, of their encounters, and those encounters are is a way. Often when we meet new characters, we get the two characters talking about the time that they saw the judge, and just that kind of philosophy or just presence is a thing that bonds men together. I don't know, that seems true to my experience of that certain kinds of things or whatever they are. If you've done a certain thing, that it's a way that bonds people together.
Well, there's two. I really like that you said that about bounds, because there's this kind of refrain that's being said about people. Whenever the gang rides together, they let me find the exact. Yeah, it's page 152. He says, conjoined, they made a thing that had not been before, and in that communal soul were wastes hardly reckonable, more than those whited regions on old maps where monsters do live. And there's this notion, too, as they ride through, that they all have eyes looking out on the desert for threats or whatever vantage, and they are wiring together, and they make this single resonance of witness that moves through the desert. And there's another moment where they're talking about taking pictures of people, and that kind of writes you into the memory, and people are tabernacled in each other, in an endless complexity of knowing and witness. And the whole witnessing is something I'd like to try and dig into out of the book, because I think there's something else being said there. And this time it's not just the judge, it's also in the narrative a lot.
Well, what's on your mind there?
That there's some kind of vision for humanity, that there is a collective knowing entity that, so if you kill someone, like that node disappears and kind of is absorbed into someone else. And there's this line where, if two men are in a duel and they both were to shoot themselves, then they would just disappear without a third person. And that third person isn't a third thing. It's not somehow auxiliary or less important, but it's the prime. It's what makes existence happen, and nothing occurs without observation, or there's not existence as we know it without that kind of first person account.
The witnessing is your point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's drawn out too, just in the fact of the setting of the book. I mean, the West is, it's desolate, and the only way that we're, the descriptions of it, sort of, I don't know, they seem to be places that, and this is also goes with the sort of, magical realist sort of landscape or whatever, but the only way that we're given these descriptions is the fact that, these people are there. It almost seems like a place that you would never think of, if there weren't those people there.
Yeah. And after one of the slaughters, there's this passage, and it's, I can't find it right now. I kind of had a list of passages, but, in a circuit of a few suns, there would be no trace of the people that had lived here, and there wouldn't be a ghost or a scribe to tell anyone that this had existed. And it's interesting, though, that we read that. So we become that witness through this recounting. It's almost as if, I don't know, that we know nothing, or that it's just an interesting way to put nothing. So no one knows about this, but that's a fact for us to know. And the witness of the narrative, or the authority of the narrative, gives us access to this world that we wouldn't be able to see if it wasn't for it being recounted to us.
Well, this seems to relate to what we were talking about earlier of the meaning of history and fact with respect to fiction and truth. So, which I guess is lensed through the judge's speeches at the end to the kid about the nature of the past to the present. So the idea that you could have something disappear and what the role of witnessing it is.
Yeah, well, he says in that last bit you mentioned, the judge says, "Did you post witnesses to report to you on the continuing existence of those places once
Yes.
you quit them?"
Yes.
And then the kid says, "That's crazy." And the judge says, "Is it? Where is yesterday? Where is Glanton and Brown? And where's the priest?" And on like that. And then, the kid says, "I guess you can tell me." And then the judge has a really interesting bit here about falseness, which I think is also a big theme in the book. He says, "I tell you this, as war becomes dishonored and its nobility called into question, those honorable men who recognize the sanctity of blood will become excluded from the dance, which is the warrior's right. And thereby will the dance become a false dance, and the dancers false dancers. And yet there will be one there always who is a true dancer. And can you guess who that might be?" And the kid says, "You ain't nothing." And the judge says, "You speak truer than you know. But I will tell you, only that man who has offered himself up entire to the blood of war, who has been to the floor of the pit and seen horror in the round, and learned at last that it speaks to his inmost heart, only that man can dance."
Yeah. So this highlights the judge's notion that life is war, and it's not sort of a simplistic, exactly war of all against all. Even Hobbes sounds pleasant in this respect, and I guess I'd like to tease out a little bit more what the judge is implying or saying about the nature of living and the nature of his relationship to war. In what you just quoted, it sounds as if there's only ever one truly living person, the one who's on top of the gore at the bottom of the pit.
Mm. Well, I remember from the No Country podcast, I forget who said it, but it was an interesting question. Does this philosophy endear you to the warring lifestyle? Like, can you believe what the judge believes without also having to go out and murder people?
So what would you believe that the judge believes?
In order to do this, what philosophy could drive you mad? Like, what would it be? Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, because his philosophy is not so much, it's just sort of, it would be the doing, right?
Yeah, and I found myself going through and wondering if you believe in that the philosophy is just in the doing, or that the life is just in the doing. The judge, at least, and I think Chagor in No Country for Old Men also goes this direction of it also being about beating and winning and killing. And so violence is not a manifestation of living in the moment and living. Violence is not a manifestation of the judge's point of view or even Chagor's point of view. It is the embodiment of it, the fact of it. It's not as if you could live another kind of life and be in the moment from from the judge's understanding. You would have to be like him to do it. You couldn't be a priest and be like the judge.
Yeah, I think that you're right. If you wanted to say, be like the judge, but also have a job, and you'd have to go in and clock in and listen to someone tell you that you were late. If you were late, all that kind of subjection that you would have to do would not be the judge's viewpoint. Like, it would be this kind of thing that happened with your life whenever you agreed to do things a certain way. Is that?
Well, but maybe I would agree with that about, having a job and stuff like that. But what if you were, a kind of hermit or traveler or whatever? Could you be a pacifist effectively?
He does meet that hermit. I mean, he
Yeah.
does meet that, and the pacifists and people that warn him against war. The Mennonite also warns him too, that you're not just going to battle, but you're going. There's the Mennonite says something. He says that, listen, yeah, you're doing a good thing and you're fighting the Apaches and they bring a lot of disaster, but there's also something else that you're going to have to reckon with, and that thing is something more evil. And he calls it a him, and you get the sense after meeting him that it is the judge, and that the judge is, even if, I mean, there's people that just do war. I mean, David Brown is a warrior. He has that scapular of ears. He
Yeah.
is doing what the judge wants him to, but the judge is something on top of that because he knows what he's doing and he can reconcile it with other. I mean, he can persuade other people and deceive, and he knows about geological time and the history of the universe, and he still does what he does. It's the judgments of life that he gives in his philosophies and sermons about things are all just kind of extra, and I don't know where they come from or why exactly that's important to the judge. But it does make him different, I think, because he gets to stand apart with that knowledge.
Yeah. I think that it's hard to escape the implicit claim of the novel, and I think it would be wrong to, or the claim in the novel is that life is utterly violent, and that living involves violence, and it's not clear to me if the judge is meant to be a kind of hero in this respect, and or the kid, or anybody exactly is meant to be a hero, or if it's more of a a painting or a landscape of the way of living as war. I hesitate to take a kind of moral judgment out of it. I read a couple things that were tried to set the novel as a kind of social commentary on interpretations of the West and stuff like that. It doesn't strike me that it's that kind of book, that it's trying to, remind us of the authentic history of the West or something like that. It might be, there might be an aspect of it that is taking the notion of the Western as a genre and working with that. But
I read an interesting interview between two authors who were talking about Blood Meridian, and they were talking about essentially like what makes a good piece of art and politics in art, because they precisely brought up that fact that the book's often read as some sort of social commentary about the Western frontier. But I'm gonna quote this because it was pretty good and it relates. It says that it takes up a subject matter that is inescapably political, but it builds a systematic violence, a work that comes to rest only in the territory of art, where the thing built is so elegant and strange that it cannot be justified or even really explained. And I think that that's what does separate it from being sort of just like a, polemic or whatever, is that it does, things come and go, and it gets to sort of sit above those things. It doesn't have to try to be that, I guess.
Well, it stands on its own in that respect. I think that's one aspect of really good art is, and really good literature, is that it has an internal integrity that doesn't make it subservient to some other claim or cause that it's trying to present. You brought up the judge's, his intellect, and how, he's the only person of intellect and reading in the whole book. I think you could maybe make the claim that almost no one else in the book even can read. And then we have this strange fact at the end of the book that the grown kid, at some point along his life picks up a Bible, and carries it around with him, but he can't read. and has never been able to read. So he has this book that he recognizes as a Bible and can't read it. But the judge himself is clearly very, very well read. He speaks many languages. He's a kind of gentleman scientist, recording facts about the world, and taking pressings of plants, and it's almost like he's the ship scientist on on a voyage, a kind of Charles Darwinish character or something. And in fact, it's that knowledge of his that allows him to harvest through his intellect the resources from the world. There's this amazing battle in which they're being chased down by the Indians, and they have no ammunition, and he fashions gunpowder from the ground itself based upon his intellect, combining the lava rock and sulfur and piss until he gets gunpowder, which incidentally is has a great parallel with Paradise Lost as well.
Really, I haven't read Paradise Lost. What's that connection?
So the devil brings gunpowder.
Huh.
I'd have to. I didn't go look through the book. I didn't. That particular connection of that really raw fact, I didn't make. I got that from Hungerford. The sense of the attractiveness of this evil character just rang true from the beginning, but she uses that as one particular fact, that it's a scene that's right out of Paradise Lost.
Huh.
So I'll have to look it up, and I can put it on the forum board.
Well, it's interesting to think that, I mean, you could assume that he's probably read Paradise Lost, the judge.
Oh yeah, sure.
And that he's sort of living that, where he's taking something from art and sort of putting that back into the world. I think that says an interesting thing about his concerns with history making, and that sort of thing.
Well, what do you think of so what does this mean, him being the intellect of the book, and him being essentially he's the poet, he's the philosopher, he's the scientist, he's the businessman of the book?
For me, initially reading it, the intellect was that part made him seem much more seductive in his means, because when you're in a presence of someone like that, especially the way he speaks, and I listened to some of this on audiobook as well, so like his speeches are, I mean, they're captivating, and there's something about having that sort of knowledge and presence that makes everything he do just utterly believable, or like this is how things should go. But I think has all the intellect because it's just, he sort of has everything in him, like a man. Just that contrasted with sort of raw violence, I think, draws things into question. That because usually it always seems that the man of all intellect is also, the man who does, a pacifist or whatever. But here we have someone who's sort of all things.
Yeah, I like what you said about that he contained it within him, because you get the sense that the judge is walking around and just devouring the known world. And anything that he can bring into himself, like those pressings you mentioned, and the sketches that he makes, he crumbles it up and throws them away after he has a representation of it. And someone asks him what he's doing, and he says, my intention is to expunge them from the memory of man. And so that he is the sole arbiter of knowledge, whenever it comes to whatever he can know. It was that interesting thing too, where he goes on to say, birds' flight is an insult to him, their freedom, their autonomy, and that anything that exists outside of his knowing is an affront and a danger to him, that he wants to contain all the world within him. And that's a really interesting claim because it's a knowledgeable one also. It's not just that he can be the last man standing, but that he is going to be the suzerain of the earth or the overlord, you know.
Yeah, I think that it seems accurate that he just sort of wants to devour all that he can know. And that literature and what is just as important as, he talks about how God created, is it the judge who talks about how the God created the world and sort of the stones are his words, like,
Yeah, stones and trees are the bones of things are God's words.
Mm-hmm. That it's something that those things are somehow on an equal level for him, that he wants, and they're just something to know and to push through, or I don't know.
I wanted to, when you brought up that word suzerain, I wanted to talk a little bit about language and McCarthy's choice of words. It's something that he gets ragged on a lot, maybe not wrongly, but because he uses a lot of $1,000 words.
Yeah, but in that passage, it's one of the few times that the character is like, what the hell is that?
Yeah.
Well, and in fact, I think where he is asking what a suzerain is, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that actually, besides wanting to it being good that he explains it in the book, is if you go look up what that word is, you realize how apt it is for describing the character of the judge, because it's not simply a king. It's a one definition was a feudal lord to whom fealty is due. So it's somebody who lords over, who has peasants and serfs, and whom respect and just and does and well and piety are due. Right? It's more than being a king. It's sort of it's closer to the ground than being a king.
That's funny because he puts his hands on the ground and says, "This is my claim."
Yeah. But there are all kinds of words that he chooses. I was in the middle of reading it, and at the end when the Yumas attack and they kill John Galton stands up. They find him in the bedroom, and his head is split to the thrapple. And I had never heard that word thrapple, so I had to go look it up. And thrapple,
yeah, it's disgusting when you find out what it is.
Thrapple is the throat. But it's used, what's even more interesting to me is it's used with respect most commonly to horses. So I think, that's just another example, like with suzerain, of a word that it sounds very unusual. If when you first hear what it means, it evokes a certain reaction. In the case of thrapple, you realize the scene is more grotesque than you might have expected. And then the meaning of the word having to do with horses and him being slaughtered like a horse, or and the whole link of this gang riding through the West, it's fitting in a way that I just think is awesome. I just think it's just such a great example of choosing a word that is so unusual but has extra resonances with it. It's just really impressive.
Yeah, I think his concern with it's like a precision and at these certain moments, because a lot of it, the language is very, I don't know, I guess maybe it's the landscapes, but it always seems just very like he has a command of writing that makes it seem like there's no other way to describe what he just described, even if it's very simple.
Yes.
And that's also just the landscapes and the fact that everything's just I don't know, but yeah, when he uses those words, it always, yeah, his precision is really, it's pretty remarkable. But I mean, there has to be some sort of concern with, I mean, the novel has no quotations. Just his style. He'd probably hate to have it called style or something, but, it's very prevalent. I mean, what do you guys make of that? I mean, along with, the specific language or
What do you mean prevalent? Is
just you can't not notice that, especially when you try to read things out loud, you're just like, man, he's not using any commas, and this is a very long sentence contrasted with a 2-word sentence that, um, I couldn't, that was always on my mind was how this thing is written.
Yeah, the closest thing that you get to having being able to see the dialogue separated off is by separating it by paragraph. And
Yeah.
sometimes you have a said in it, but again, it's a kind of matter of fact rendering. And then the inclusion of Spanish.
Yeah.
And in fact, you have these cases because the kid doesn't speak Spanish, where it's like listening to a movie without subtitles, and this kid's speaking in English, and you're trying to interpret what is being said to him, but you're in the position of the kid himself. He doesn't know what's being said to him. You have to sort of figure it out, or Spanish and you know what's being said to him.
Do either of you know Spanish?
I know a little bit of it, that I could get through most of it, and then other parts I just went and looked up.
Yeah, I'm about the same.
Well, I wondered about the juggler scene, because that was an instance where people aren't sure what. There's the juggler that comes with his wife and his daughter, and they're reading fortunes.
What page is that?
That's on 96. Or just before that on 95. So it really continues from page 92 to 95.
Yep.
And there's the 4 of cups that is turned over for the kid.
Yep.
And the kid sees the 4 of cups going through a village that was ransacked by the Indians. And it's interesting that that's there again, and he becomes afraid and shakes it off. And I think that they start saying something, the wife of the juggler is put a blindfold around, and she's going to tell fortunes based on what cards people turn over. And Black Jackson's asking what she says, and the judge is helping explain. And he's getting a kick out of it. It's like the judge knows how the trick is being done, and he's enjoying watching the group get turned inside out, especially Glanton, who he's a little bit superstitious. And so when the judge tells the juggler to go over and do Glanton, tell his fortune, he's like messing with Glanton. He's like keeping Glanton in check, I felt like, by letting him, be mastered, at least in a joke or an illusion or a magic trick.
Well, it's not clear that the the juggler wants to do this, right? Because the judge has to tell him to go to El Jefe.
Yeah. The juggler
several
comes up
times
to do it, but the judge is like, do the boss.
Yeah.
He's like, are you sure? And he's like, the boss.
Yes. Yeah.
Again, and it stirs Glanton up, and he pulls a gun. He's going to shoot the fortune teller, but then the judge wraps his arms around him and stops him from doing it. Which is interesting, because I think that's the only time he stayed violence in the book. Well, guys, we're about at an hour and a half. I think we've touched on a lot of really good stuff, but if there's anything else in particular that you wanted to bring up, I thought maybe we could try and focus down on those for the next just little, bit.
I had one thing that I wanted to talk about before we were done, which was the title of the book. Both Blood Meridian, and then why the subtitle, or the evening redness in the west.
I mean, Meridian is used once. I think it might be twice. One time it's used to describe the sun's arc and its setting, and then the second time, I think the judge uses it, and he says that man is exhausted at the height of his accomplishment. His high mark is at once the meridian and the evening of his day. so that you get this sense of accomplishment in your life, and the works that you do are leading up to an ascension, and then it breaks and then goes down the other side, and then you kind of go under again, and mankind is just like going up and going under. And it relies on blood. Its life is carried through blood, the tempering agent for the mortar that binds. So those are just some shots at it that I have, but I don't. It's still a puzzle.
Well, so are you thinking of Meridian as the thing that you cross? So in the sky, the meridian cuts the Earth in half, and it's the point of highest ascent of the sun. It is the midpoint between the dawn and the setting of the sun, and it is and it would mark a point of path for the sun. Or are you thinking of it as an arc, that cuts from north to south, separating the east from the west, kind of thing?
See, I guess I haven't looked it up. I thought that the meridian was the arc from east to west of the sun's traveling, so that you begin and it's climbing up this, to the meridian, and then it falls off on the other side and it's descension.
No, it's not actually. The meridian is the longitudinal line. So when you talk about the prime meridian, you have to pick. So the meridians are cleaving the Earth from the north to the south pole as lines of longitude. And so when you measure time, we have these offsets in hours based upon time zones, and you would have to pick a place to start at your clock at 0, because you have 24 hours around the Earth, and you need to pick a place to start at 0. So that's why we have Greenwich Mean Time. That's the prime meridian. It goes through Greenwich, England, and from there you measure time away from that meridian as the prime meridian, the first one. And when the sun goes through the sky, it crosses a meridian.
Interesting. Then what would that mean for blood and humans and people that are constantly convoluting in and out of humanity,
I thought about just, like violence and just the language, because if you look at the subtitle, he uses blood. It's blood meridian or the evening redness. You sort of get to contrast those things before you even open the book, to just sort of draw into question. Because you're going to read a world that is sort of subsumed by violence, and it's even there in the language that to describe some redness, that you can use blood, or even saying the word redness draws those ideas of that. And, I don't know, I thought about it in those terms.
Yeah, one of the things that's confusing to me about it is that the evening redness in the west makes me think of a sunset.
Mm-hmm.
And Meridian simply didn't make me think of a sunset. It makes me think of a crossing, of a halving, of the almost like when you cross from one side of a mountain to another, you go from one watershed to another, and that the water always flows down to the east on one side and down to the west on the other side, as a kind of meridian of the land. And I was, when I think blood meridian, I think of at the end of the book, among those speeches that the judge is making, he says, talks about blood as being the feature of this life. And in fact, I think maybe you read it, and I'm just trying to remember where it was at the end. But so I guess I don't know really what to do with it exactly. Another thing about Meridian is it makes me think of traveling, and of course, a big part of the book is a road story.
Yeah, to sort of talk about what where you brought up the words that he uses, and he can point you in like a really specific direction. He doesn't do that here. He leaves it way open.
Well, I just want to bring up when the judge talks about meridians.
Which page is that on?
This is it's page 140. Page 140.
Ah, I have it marked.
Yeah, he says, "The way of the world is to bloom and to flower and die, but in the affairs of men there is no waning, and the noon of his expression signals the onset of night. His spirit is exhausted at the peak of its achievement. His meridian is at once his darkening and the evening of his day."
Okay.
He loves games, yeah, and then from there. So there's the evening, and then also the meridian together, but that's as much as I can do for it, you know.
Well, so that makes sense now. Now I understand how, in the judge's words, the meridian is the beginning of the fall, the beginning of the end, and the twilight is at the noon. And so that makes the juxtaposition of the two pieces of the title make sense to me. And the blood being in the peak. I'm still looking on the page for where this is. Where on?
I have it on this
on this electronic device.
On this electronic device, which has its values and has its negatives.
Okay,
but
so
if you
what's the beginning of the paragraph?
The beginning of the paragraph is, "Hold now," said Tobin. The question was put in all earnestness.
Okay.
This is after the judge talks about children.
You said it was on...
Oh, here it is, 146 in paper. And then it's at the bottom of 146.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's... I'd have to think about it a little bit more, but it has some... Having be blood at the... the role of blood at the... in violence as foundational to us living at our peaks, according to the judge, is obviously central to that title.
Well, just the next bit below that, when he says loves games, I guess I'd like to bring up a thread I saw of games, because you see here, these ruins wondered at by tribes of savages. Do you not think that this will be again and again? And then if you go to the last of the book where he's talking with the kid, it is on 331.
Yep. And
he's talking about, I think it's before that. He says, man is born for games.
Yep.
And he says, war is the ultimate game because the stakes are the game itself.
Yep.
And then I wanted to jump to the end because he says,
hey guys, I actually have to head out. So, thanks for the conversation. I'm sorry I can't stay, but...
Did you have a closing or something you wanted to leave us with, Jordan?
I don't know. I think we talked about everything. I'm not the most apt at doing summation, so...
Well, thanks for making it out and being flexible as we try to get this thing organized.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's really good.
It's a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, it was really a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Jordan. Well, hey, yeah, I know that we're getting close to the hour. I just wanted to point out that bit about the game there, though. It was on 329.
Okay, great. Let me get that. Okay.
And on that bottom paragraph, he says, "Never doubt it," and that begins what I was interested in.
Why don't you read it?
"That feeling in the breast that evokes a child's memory of loneliness, such as when the others have gone and only the game is left with its solitary participant. A solitary game without opponent, where only the rules are at hazard. Don't look away, we are not speaking in mysteries. You of all men are no stranger to that feeling, the emptiness and the despair. It is that which we take arms against, is it not?
Yeah, is not blood the tempering agent in the mortar which bonds?" The judge leaned closer. "What do you think death is, man? Of whom do we speak when we speak of a man who was and who is not? Are these blind riddles, or are they not some part of every man's jurisdiction? What is death if not an agency, and whom does he intend toward?"
It's a terrifying moment at the end of the book, but it really sums up a lot of what I think is being said, that mankind is particular and it's fluid between those particular people, so that survivors carry forward mankind and there's something resolved in the manifestation of those wills when they are put into contest. That's something that the judge says. But about the emptiness and that feeling of despair, I think that's the closest you get to some kind of vulnerable moment with the judge. And
Well, it is, but he's pointing to the despair when there's only rules and no opponent. So in some ways, the I take him as saying that the violence and the killing and the blood um, are the manifestation of actual living, because without it you have emptiness and despair, because you need to have that conflict, because otherwise you just have a game, you have solitaire, and a game without stakes is no game at all, and in fact it's just depressing.
and then what do you think death is? That and that right there seems that man's agency, his will to live, is what death is. That living has a pressing effect on everybody
Yes.
else around, and it balks you if you're not in the current of it, and you can be subsumed. And if you're going to be the one true liver or the one living, then you are an agency on other men, whether or not you know it or not.
Yes. Yes, I think that's right.
Well, I want to, the last thing I want to touch on would be the passage of the dream with the child or with the kid after he's gotten free of everyone in the desert on page 310. He has that dream. And it's, I think, the closest you get to an explanation of the judge, and also kind of carries the stuff onward.
Okay.
It begins on 309 at the very bottom.
Yep.
It says, "In that sleep and in sleeps to follow, the judge did visit. A great shambling mutant, silent and serene. Whatever his antecedents, he was something wholly other than their sum. Nor was there system by which to divide him back into his origins, for he would not go." But you see that there's a man hammering out a coin in the dream, and he's shadowed by the judge standing over the kid while he sleeps. And it says that the judge enshadowed him where he crouched at his trade, perhaps hammering out like his own conjectural destiny, all through the night of his becoming, some coinage for a dawn that would not be. It is this false moneyer, with his gravers and burns, who seeks favor with the judge, and he is at contriving from cold slag, brute in the crucible, a face that will pass, an image that will render this residual species current in the markets where men barter. Of this is the judge, and the night does not end. And the false game, the false moneyer, the false dancers, those who try and have a judgment about things outside of, I don't really know, but I feel like it's right in there that the markets where men barter are where we trade our living, or where we can pay someone to do work for us, or we could kill them, but that payment is a certain kind of in between that forceful living that we have, that our wills create a force, and you can have money and rules and games and law, but those are ultimately coins. They're just images of the representation that violence and killing can really communicate the only true thing in the world, and that's existence. That violence has some kind of penultimate thing that subsumes all those others.
Yeah.
I mean, I just got stuck there because it says, "Of this is the judge, and the night does not end." In another point, the kid asks, "What's he a judge of?" And the priest is like, "Don't ask. He can hear you."
Yes. Yeah.
So it's interesting to me that there's a lot of mystery in the book. And, even the judge says books lie. There's not really, you're discouraged from even looking for an origin to the judge, what unraveling of ledger books or where he came from. You're still not going to find anything out. But I'm still compelled to dig,
Yeah. Well, I think, part of it is that I feel like the judge is an incredibly vibrant character, but he's also in some way completely undynamic. In ways he's a piece of nature, and so you can figure out what he's sort of about, but he's not. He's like the landscape. He's not something that's changing. He's not a character that undergoes development, right? he's not any different at the beginning of the book, at the end of the book, than he is at the beginning of the book. Um, and
Yeah, that's true.
and he's never. He also never has uncertainty. He's always doing out of complete certainty. He might be vulnerable in a physical sense. And I guess you pointed to one point where it sounded like he might be vulnerable in a spiritual sense, in where he's considering a universe without, the possibility of games that have no stakes. But I feel like it's more like he's describing something, and when he talks about the kid or the man knowing what that terror was like, I feel like if the judge actually knows what that is like, it's out of a long ago memory, or seeing it in the eyes of other men. But it's something that he does not partake in. And so the scene at the end with him dancing, and him being in the midst of that, it's a funny kind of adoration, right? It's he's this, in some ways, the center of attention, but also in the periphery, and that's just the way he wants it. And it's he's at one time the most important man in the room, and in some ways the least important person in the room as far as everybody else is concerned, because he's so no one wants to actually be near him exactly.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, he's duplicitous like that. He can be the great favorite, and he can be the life of the party. But that's the thing; it's not coming from him. I think you make a good point of that. It's like he's the fiddler for it. He's just being true to mankind and letting other men do what they will with that. He's just the one that's going to give ability to the dark heart.
Yes.
And he needs other people to make a covenant with, to ride with. Like, there's not I just don't imagine the judge out doing it alone.
No.
He needs the audience and the will of everybody kind of coagulated into him to be something substantial at all.
Yeah, and in fact, except for the beginning, where you hear the story of how he came to be part of the gang, where they say they found him in the middle of the desert. I don't think he's ever really alone. I mean, later at the end of the book, when he's abandoned, or he's out in the desert, he has the idiot with him.
Mm. Yeah, it's almost like he needs to be tethered to reality through others.
Yeah.
In order,
Yeah, I suppose. Because I was thinking about the other books that I've read by McCarthy. I did want to point out that maybe I'd be interested if you agree with this, is that one thing that's utterly missing out of a book like this is love. There's no presence of love and the vulnerability of love. And I would contrast that with a book like The Road, or even No Country for Old Men, which has men in it who are vulnerable in different ways. But in The Road, which I don't know if you've read, you have a similar kind of typical, desert-ish landscape, and the very factual speaking and almost biblical kind of writing. But you have the undercurrent of care. And at the end, you have, it's not exactly hopeful, but you have the sense of there being future that involves children who might flourish rather than be twisted. Whereas in Blood Meridian, I think that that's just utterly missing. And it makes me, think about, McCarthy's, the changes he might have in terms of being a writer and becoming older himself and stuff like that.
Mm. Well, there's a few things that are interesting. I mean, he writes about a kid that was born in 1833 and McCarthy was born in 1933.
Oh, I
And
didn't know that.
yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff too in the road about light and darkness and kind of being this I'm going to use the word tabernacle because McCarthy uses it in Blood Meridian. I think it's really apt that you're some kind of house for the human spirit that gets carried forward and either can kindle more of it in other people or not. And you don't really get that in this one. I mean, I think of the barkeeper that helps the kid whenever no one else does. He's shot at the very beginning. He's looked after, but then he runs away because he can't pay her and he
Yeah.
just moves on. I mean, he goes to that old woman and he tells her that he's going to convey her to a safe place and he's going to look after her, but then she's dead. And, we assume that he ran away because his mother died, but it could just also be because that happened at a time where he had to strike out on his own. You're right. You don't really get that in the novel. And I mean, there's one time where the Borginus woman takes the idiot and then baptizes him and then gives him his name.
Yeah.
But then he wanders off like an idiot and gets drowned, and the judge pulls him up in this reverse baptism, And so, yeah, it feels like it's there, but if it was left in the road with any kind of hope, it's constantly thwarted or just undercut or accidents happen. And that's what I think is interesting about Chigurh and the judge is this force of nature, but Chigurh gets hit by a car at the end. Like he's as much a part of the world, as anybody else and subject to it. But the judge is kind of outside. And I think that's an interesting move just across, I don't know, McCarthy's villains or what worldview that speaks to. I don't really know.
Yeah, the judge is outside of the world in a way that that Holden isn't. And in fact, the kid, or actually, in No Country for Old Men, the
Llewellyn.
Llewellyn has a kind of motion and intensity and integrity that is missing from the kid. The kid reminds me more of some of the characters in like The Crossing, Billy Parham and stuff.
Well, I don't know. I think that Llewellyn, he goes back to give that guy water.
Yeah.
And the kid, he's running away and like he stops and helps. Like they're running away from Apaches and this one guy's horse has a broken leg and he walks with him for a while instead of just leaving him.
No,
And
I get what you're saying. I'm just thinking that I felt like, yeah, I think that they're very parallel characters and they're functioning very similarly in the novel. I just felt like Llewellyn's character was less of a victim or less of a man of circumstance than the kid seems to be. The kid seems to be have moments of charging through life the way in the Crossing, I think it's Billy Parham, who there's this absolutely beautiful. I think you can read it almost by itself. The first 100 pages of that book, in where he's going through the mountains with the taking the she-wolf back and that whole scene, and then by the end, Billy is at the side of the road.
It's heartbreaking.
It's just terrible.
He threw a stone at a dog and then feels bad about it and goes and looks for it and then just sits down on the road and cries at the end. Oh man.
Yeah. So I feel like the kid is more like that character than and Llewellyn is a kind of has I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, he found money. He made a plan about it. I mean, he thought that he could do something with his life with an opportunity. I mean, the kid, joins the military to get a saddle and a horse. Yeah. He does that later on as a man, and he gets a job just so he can get things, and then moves on. And you don't really know what internally motivates him. And I guess Llewellyn, maybe he loved his wife, or maybe he has an opportunity to forget about her, and it kind of looks like he did at the end. And there's just that lack of internality or what have you that makes it tough to look at what these guys think about the world or what they feel or what the tension between thinking and feeling does to you. Because, I mean, they say, there's this moment where they wake up and the city's gone that they wanted to walk to. And he says, well, your mind makes you see what you want to see. says, well, I sure as hell want to see it now. Why isn't it here?
Yeah.
And like that kind of, and someone asks him, you can imagine better ways for the world to be, but you can't make it that way, can you? And the kid's like, no, I guess I can't. And that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
that seems like a good place to stop.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for coming on and being flexible and reading this with us. It was a real treat.
Oh, it was fun. I think it's a great idea, and I'll try to do. I like reading fiction, so I'll try to do some more in the future. I just my life is so swamped that it was real work for me to fit this in, and I was really glad that I did. But I'll try to keep it in mind for the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
And keep up the good work with this. This is really good stuff.